I would record whatever we say, because the Environmental Peacebuilding Association has an interest to share it via its platform. If you're not okay with being on the record, please tell me, then I will stop the recording for whatever you want to say off record. Okay, so welcome everyone to the virtual seminar, to the webinar on disasters, gender, peace and conflict. My name is Tobias Ide. I'm a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, working on a project on disasters and armed conflict. And when I studied the literature, I recognized there's a lot of work on disasters and armed conflict, and how disasters might increase conflict risks, or how conflicts increase vulnerability to disasters. And then yet there's another literature on gender, women, peace, conflict, and security, which studies, among others, the role of gender identities in promoting or curbing violence, but also the unequal impact of violence on different gendered groups. And yet there's another literature on disasters and gender, which also studies in depth how disasters intersect with gender and various categories to promote different forms of vulnerability, and how this plays with disaster risk reduction and recovery roads. And that's only a very small piece of what's actually out there. Yet what I found astonishing is that there is a lot of interest in disasters and conflict, disasters and gender, and conflict and gender, but there's very little dialogue between these three bodies of literature. Not saying there's nothing at all, but compared to what's happening within these fields, there's very little dialogue between these fields, which I think is a gap, and that's increasingly recognized by various actors, as indicated among others by the recent UN report on gender, climate change, and security. So today we have with us 4 experts on, I'd say, all 3 of those topics, who've worked extensively both in practice and in research on on the various interlinkages between those topics. And I'm very happy that they can join the webinar, and we have the opportunity to discuss and elaborate among these interlinkages. The webinar is co-sponsored by the Disaster Resilience and the Gender Interest Groups of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, which is an association promoting research and practitioner exchange on the various interlinkages between environment and peacebuilding. And it's also co-sponsored by the Faculty of Science of the University of Melbourne, who allowed me generously to use its professional Zoom account to have the webinar mode activated. So without going into further details, I would turn over to our panelists. I will introduce each panelist briefly before he or she gives a brief input of around 10 minutes. And there's one question which I would ask each participant to answer in their introductory talk, which is, what are the benefits of thinking gender, disasters, and peace and conflict together, rather than focusing on only 2 or even only 1 of those topics? What are the additional insights, both from an academic, but perhaps also from a practice perspective? And after we heard the introductory talks, I'm very happy to open the floor to both audience questions. I'm very happy to receive them via the chat, but you can also raise your hand, or as well as to debate among the panelists. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Marissa. Marissa is currently based at Georgetown University's Justice, Peace, and Peace Studies program in Washington, D.C. She's a trained anthropologist who's working on disasters, environmental change, conflict, and displacement and security, with a particular focus on disasters and on gender and use. She has produced more than 15 years of scholarship, and she also has more than 15 years of practice experience in conflict-affected and fragile countries, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And as a result of this, she has published 5 books and over 40 journal articles and book chapters, including a chapter in the recent report on gender, climate, and security that I mentioned in the introduction. So what I will do now is I will get this meeting back to full screen. Which isn't working as nice as I thought it would work, but just give me 1 second. Okay, I'm very sorry. I need 1 minute. I just need to stop sharing and then I'm back in the mode. Okay, now, Marissa, I will make you co-host so you can share your slides.
All right, well, while you do that, thank you, Tobias, for that introduction. I am thrilled to be in conversation with my fellow panelists and with the rest of the audience. Wherever you are in the world, welcome. And a special shout out to our colleagues here on the East Coast of the US for joining us at 7 a.m. on a Monday morning. A very good morning to you. Now, I've been given 10 minutes to discuss why I think that disasters and violence, conflict and peace should be examined in combination together with gender. Now, the short answer would be that in the current geopolitical and ecological context, where complex emergencies are not just increasingly common, but increasingly the norm, examine the various dimensions of these various elements in combination is the only way to properly understand their synergies. So disasters and conflict are not just mutually interrelated, but often mutually constitutive. More about that in a minute. Now, as for gender, I wish I could simply note that it goes without saying that gender dynamics must always be examined in any consideration of any aspect of the human experience. Unfortunately, and especially in the context of crisis, the tyranny of the urgent often replaces lessons learned, best practices, and common sense. And gender-blind approaches still are put in place, which are often not inclusive, less than inclusive, and not as effective as they could be at best. And in many cases, they end up replicating or even exacerbating patterns of gender discrimination that were already in place in the societies at hand before the crisis. Now, I've prepared a few slides that I would like to share with you if technology cooperates. So give me a second, share screen. And, all right. Oops. All right. Is everybody seeing my first slide?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. All right. So let me move on. So I would like to preface my remarks with a quote from Professor Lederac, which very succinctly and elegantly encapsulates the gist of my presentation. Our survival depends on our capacity to understand and honor interdependence. In the current global context, the international community faces an era of unprecedented multiplicity and complexity of disasters. The evidence pointing to linear causality between disasters and conflict is, however, rather limited. Nevertheless, while the link may not always be a causal one, the relationship between disasters and conflict can be, and often is, mutually reinforcing. Disasters that occur in conflict-affected and fragile contexts are likely to exacerbate the impacts and fault lines of that conflict. At the same time, the impacts of a disaster, such as food insecurity and disruption of markets, have the potential to reinforce drivers of conflict. Next slide. Oh, hold on, let me come back. So the world is facing an ever more complex horizon of multiple crises, risk and vulnerability, including disasters, climate change, protracted conflict, forced displacement, food insecurity, ecological erosion, urban crisis, and pandemics. There's a critical need to reduce disaster risk, especially in fragile and conflict-affected states. There's growing evidence from the field that people and institutions in fragile and conflict-affected states are much more vulnerable to natural hazards. Thus, for the international community to most effectively address vulnerability to disasters, it must consider fragility and conflict as core drivers of vulnerability. There is an interdependence between disaster risks and risk related to conflict, fragility, and violence. Evidence suggests that conflict and fragility increase vulnerability to hazards and can weaken the capacity of governments and local institutions to protect communities from and respond to disasters. Disasters can also exacerbate conflict fault lines and social exclusion. Inequity and post-disaster assistance can either fuel new grievances by deepening the conflict and strengthening one faction or the other, or open up political opportunities for building trust and cooperation. The intersections between disasters and conflict and fragility are manifold and affect countries, communities, and individuals facing multiple gender-differentiated risks and vulnerabilities. There is a need to better understand the ways in which risks interact, reinforce, and compound one another. Examining how gender-differentiated vulnerabilities and resilience interact is thus critical to understanding the relationship between disasters, violence, and conflict. It is important to bear in mind that neither crisis nor post-crisis interventions happen in a vacuum, but in a context of pre-existing sociocultural norms, which always include gender power dynamics and legislations. This challenging operating environment in disaster and conflict-affected contexts can result in humanitarian responses exacerbating pre-existing or creating new gender inequalities through unequal distribution of aid, for instance. What I am discussing here is not really new. My doctoral research was a gendered political ecological analysis of violence and disaster-induced displacement in Central America with a focus on Honduras. Now, the title of the book that came out of my dissertation is The Legacy of Hurricane Mitch, which is far more manageable. And by the way, that banner reads, "No more murders of peasants along the Awan River." And this is a region where local farmers, local peasants, are being forcibly displaced or murdered to make room from, to replace their subsistence agriculture with monoculture, cash crops, and plantations. My book came out in 2009, I believe, but the patterns I identify in my fieldwork have persisted and in fact, in many cases, have intensified rather in more recent times. And this is a clear illustration of the correlation, if not direct causation, between catastrophic environmental change and increasing violence. And this is another one. And I'm just going to leave there for a few seconds so that you can read what I wrote there myself, yourselves rather. And the second chapter to this story . So the positive conclusion of the story is that in 2018, partly in response to the death of Berta Cáceres, 24 Latin American and Caribbean countries signed a legally binding pact to protect the rights of environmental defenders. And on December the 2nd of 2019, so this past Christmas, the 7 men found guilty of killing Berta Cáceres were sentenced to 30 to 50 years. And the project to build a dam on the river has been permanently, or at least for now, halted. Okay. I am running out of time already, so I want to quickly show you another example from South Sudan, another country where I've been in and out for over a decade, which clearly illustrates the link between conflict, and that is a brief summary of a brief historical overview. Essentially, in the last 120 years, South Sudan has witnessed little more than very violent conflict, punctuated by brief periods of negative peace. And here we are, 2 years after the signing of the revitalized peace agreement, with the cessation of hostilities being repeatedly violated. And this is the environmental situation. Okay. So South Sudan is among the 5 most vulnerable countries in the world, according to the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. So on the one hand, environmental conditions are becoming increasingly arid with intensified and prolonged periods of drought, but also punctuated by erratic and brief but torrential rains. And that is exactly what's happening right now. Okay, so these photographs are from last week. Okay, I was supposed to be in South Sudan myself, as I do every year during summer and fall, but this year COVID-19 happened, and these photographs were taken by this organization, Assistance Mission for Africa, AMA, which is one of the main groups I work with when I am in South Sudan, and we're in constant correspondence. And they sent me these photographs from the region close to the River Nile, where one of the primary sites where I work. And as a result, massive displacement. Approximately 600,000 people have been displaced in the last few months, in addition to all of the millions that were already displaced. Food is scarce, and as you can see, the majority of people in this, this is not even an IDP camp or a protection of civilians camp, it's just people, women and children primarily, migrating en masse. And well, the reason most of the men are not here is that these groups are pastoralists. They practice transhuman pastoralism. And so the women, children, and elderly men remain more or less sedentary in the communities, practicing a form of horticulture, while the men move around with the cattle. And so when the communities, the sedentary communities are affected, it is primarily the women, children, and elderly men that are affected by them. Okay. Well, this photograph up here, this one I took myself in September of 2018. This was the celebration of the year-old peace building peace conference, which was the first time that South Sudanese women were invited or allowed to participate in one such peace conference. These other images are also from last week and the week before. These are in the settlements, the displacement camps, women coming together and discussing what their needs are, what their requirements are, and very politically active at the community level, and very, very much aware of the relationship between environmental conditions and the increases in violence. So what I'm concluding here is that South Sudanese women's voices are loud and clear. They need to not just be heard, but also acted upon. Because what's frequently happening is that they form their own women-only, women-led groups, and they go through the entire process. They come up with a resolution, and in a very tokenistic manner that is registered and completely ignored. And that is not what we mean when we talk about gender inclusivity. All right, so I am totally out of time. So let me finalize my remarks for now. So the international community, scholars, practitioners, and policymakers must better understand the multidimensional and interrelated nature of risks and crises, that is the political ecology of disasters and conflict and violence. International partners need to properly integrate the implications of this analysis for their own strategies and approaches. We must move from standard setting to implementation. Strategic partnerships must be strengthened in future engagements in environmentally fragile and conflict-prone countries. In other words, we must go beyond traditional siloed approaches. Each step of the process must mainstream gender considerations, but we must also recognize that gender and age are relational universal variables, but there are other markers that must also be taken into consideration, such as ethnicity, race, religious affiliations, that can be relevant and then as well. All right, so those are my remarks for now. And let me rejoin the group for the rest of the presentations and then for the discussion. All right, let's see if I can do this. Stop sharing. Am I back? Yes. All right.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Marissa. That was a great presentation, and I like that you highlighted the complexities and the multiple interlinkages right from the start. And I also like the positive note you gave on your Latin American case, that also there is so much violence and repression. Actually, the story goes on and there are some positive developments at the end. I think that's some sort of evidence that is really needed. So thanks for sharing it with us.
Sure. I think you need to have a positive attitude to work in this field. It really helps. All right.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I would now hand over to our second panelist, which is Virginie Lemasson. I'm not very fluent in French, so I hope I pronounced the name correctly. So Virginie is a research associate with the Overseas Development Institute in London and a co-director of the Gender for Disaster and at the Center for Gender and Disaster at University College London. A human geographer by training, she's working on social justice, gender equality, and human rights, especially in the context of climate change and disasters. She has published several recent book chapters, books, and journal articles on these topics. And she also frequently works with civil society organizations, including most recently with Plan International on armed conflict, gender-based violence, and girls' livelihoods in the Sahel. So I'm pretty much looking forward to another interesting speech. Virginie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for the introduction, and thank you for this opportunity to meet my fellow panelists and to talk about these very important questions, to dedicate an entire webinar to it. So I don't have a presentation. I'd like to share with you a few reflection points that are based on recent studies that I've had the privilege to work on. And to address your initial question, to me, linking gender inequalities, disasters, and conflict does not only make sense conceptually and practically when designing humanitarian interventions, for instance, it's also mandatory for the security and human rights of the most marginalized people. And the reason why I'm saying that it's mandatory, it's related, I think, to the way I conceptualize disasters and conflicts. So first, disasters. They result from the occurrence of natural hazards on one hand and the underlying vulnerable context of a place or a system. The end is important because it's still completely overlooked by emergency responses globally. So we focus on natural phenomena, but we don't focus on the reasons why they create disasters. And the consequence of not placing adequate attention on the socioeconomic and political factors that create disasters means that we continue to blame hurricanes, earthquakes, droughts for disasters, and we don't tackle the issues that are inequalities and that are within our control, because it's also politically convenient to do so. So to bring a gender perspective is disruptive, it's mandatory, it's useful, and it's a way to focus on the socioeconomic construction of disasters, but it's often incorrect politically by those in power. That's one way of conceptualizing disasters and how I bring a gender perspective to it. The second is conflict. I associate conflicts with violence, as my colleague Marissa did. And there is violence perpetrated by combatants and armed groups on the one hand, but there's also violence inflicted every day by family members, such as domestic violence on the other hand. And so when I think about conflict, there's a whole literature around gender and peace and conflict that associate images of war-affected areas. But actually, in my recent work, I see conflict more occurring at the household level. And so the reason I'm bringing this on the table is because the gender lens enables us to consider conflict at different scales, starting at the household level. And when focusing on that level, the issue of violence affecting girls and women become just obvious. So I recently worked on 2 studies in the Sahel, as you introduced, one in Chad and one in Mali and Burkina. And in both cases, the research questions that were commissioned by the NGOs that we worked with were focusing on trying to document the impacts of disasters, conflicts, and climate change on the well-being of women and girls. And the key message that I would like to highlight by way of summarizing our studies is that rather than emphasizing the impacts of environmental shocks and stresses, our analysis demonstrated that it is the everyday violence against girls and women perpetrated by their own family and community members that undermine their resilience to cope and respond to crisis. I would like to say, and to add, almost regardless of the natural hazards that affect the area where they live. And so bottom line, it's not a drought or an earthquake that generate gender-based violence, and yet it's gender-based violence that undermine people's resilience. So for example, experiences of early marriage, denial of access and control over resources, being ostracized by one's own family if one becomes pregnant after being raped, sexual violence within the household. These are all examples of GBV or gender-based violence that impact negatively on the ability of survivors to secure their livelihoods. And that undermines not only their own resilience, but it also undermines the resilience of their family members and the community to adapt to environmental changes because they are excluded from decision-making, because they are not contributing economically, and because their voices are silenced. So coping mechanisms in the context of limited livelihoods, opportunities, and competition over natural resources lead to gender-based violence, and that's increasingly being documented, reported. And that leads to gender-based violence risk for both adolescent girls and women, for example, sexual exploitation in exchange of food or water. But that also affects others, like male migration with the potential risk of recruitment in armed groups, which is definitely the case in the Sahel area. The consequences are detrimental for resilience capacities through reinforcing women's lack of safety and undermining social cohesion in communities of origin. So the main recommendation from those different studies is that interventions that focus on resilience building, interventions labeled as climate change, adaptation, or disaster risk reduction, they must all address violence against women and girls, particularly if they claim and to aim at building peace and security. Thanks.
Thanks, Virginie. That were some fascinating thoughts on how what we often term natural disasters are not quite that natural, and how the underlying social structures that make disasters affect various groups, including boys and girls, and their specific vulnerabilities to suffer from hazards or to be recruited into armed groups are very differently affected, yet still shaped by the underlying structures rather than the hazards themselves. And that's something, if you talk to people outside of a very core group of social scientists, something that is still often not fully recognized. So I think it's an important intervention you're doing there. I would like to hand over, and as we are half to two-thirds through our participants, I would remind, through our inputs, I would remind all attendees that whenever you feel like, you can raise your hand or voice a question via the chat or the Q&A, so we have a lively discussion after the panel, but you can also do that later. For now, I would like to introduce Susan Kozak. She's a PhD candidate at the Gender, Peace and Security Center at Monash University, as you can clearly see from the very nice background. She's working on social production and the gender division of labor during disasters. Since 2005, she has worked with various UN agencies on women's empowerment, gender-based violence, aid coordination, and women, peace and security in various countries, including Kenya, Zimbabwe, Rwanda, and Egypt. And she also worked with the Swedish government on gender and disaster risk reduction. Susanna, thanks for joining us tonight. Our time, I may say, we're not too far apart. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tobias, and thank you also to Marissa and Virginie for sharing really interesting points, which I think I'll probably repeat to some extent. Now, in terms of, I'll be focusing on two specific aspects. First, I'll speak to the issue about how gender equality perspective can advance an integrated disaster and conflict agenda. And then I'll end with a note on some of the barriers to achieving this, which I believe need to be part of this discussion in order to understand how we can do this better. So gender has been thoroughly analyzed in relation to peace and conflict through the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And disasters, as well as climate change, have also been discussed and critically analyzed from a gender perspective. And in my view, these analyses are not that different from each other, because a gender analysis allows us to ask a different set of questions and to put different perspectives into focus, which in the long term are important in order to build resilience, peace, and security. And the Women, Peace and Security agenda helps us to understand security in a different manner, moving away from the sort of militarized understanding of security, and instead focusing on human security in terms of long-term development and human rights and freedom and, of violence, even in so-called peacetime, like Virginie was just talking about. And such an understanding of security is, of course, also important in terms of disasters and climate change. So by asking this different set of questions, and this can highlight the different impacts of crisis and make them more visible, not only the different impacts between men and women as groups, but also within these groups. And these questions can also put into focus the agency of women, as Marisa was talking, like within like indigenous women as environmental defenders, or women negotiating micro ceasefires in Syria to ensure safe passage for food and water for the families, or collectively producing homemade masks and soap for displaced populations in Idlib in response to the COVID pandemic. So the gender perspective highlights how pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities are exacerbated in conflict and in disasters, like it's been mentioned. And it also puts a focus on this everyday lived realities of people, and bringing gender, disaster, and peace building together actually gives a fuller reflection of that reality. People affected by disasters, gender discrimination, or conflict, they don't really have the luxury of distinguishing these issues separately. They all mesh together as one lived experience, and policies need to be able to address them, not separately, but together. I want to specifically highlight how the integration of the Women, Peace and Security agenda and sort of a feminist political economy analysis can be useful in the analysis of disaster and conflict, because such an analysis shows how resilience and recovery in crises rely on what we can call the hidden labor of unpaid care and domestic work, which is largely performed by women. In addition to what Virginie was saying in terms of gender-based violence, I guess I want to also highlight the issue of social reproductive labor. As we have seen in different kinds of crises, such as the global financial crisis, but also in conflict contexts, many policies and interventions aimed at resilience and recovery largely ignore social reproductive labor. And the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted how the gender division of labor increases women's social reproductive labor disproportionately in comparison to men in crisis situations. A recent study by Monash Gender Peace and Security Center in Myanmar and Sri Lanka showed that increased depletion of women and girls through social reproductive labor is a consequence of conflict because of the breakdown of social infrastructure. So we need to understand how conflict and disaster risks could be fueled by intentional or unintentional neglect of social reproductive needs, and how this could compromise household resilience to disaster, climate change, but also conflict, displacement, migration, or even individuals' participation in violent extremism. So this provides an argument for a different set of solutions, such as social protection as part of both disaster risk reduction and peace building. And it calls for longer term investments in social reproductive infrastructure in order to create a society which is able to regenerate itself without depending on the free labor of women and girls, or by further disempowering already marginalized people. So I think that the gender perspective can give us specific actionable ideas on how to build a social contract or peace between different actors, while also considering the environmental issues. But if we all agree on the benefits of an integrated approach to gender, disaster, and conflict, how do we make sure it gets reflected in policy and practice? And why are we all not already doing it? I believe that we also need to understand some of the barriers which stop us from actually bringing in a more holistic or integrated way of formulating and implementing policies. How will we make sure that policymakers and practitioners reflect this in their work? Now, producing knowledge is one thing which can fall upon us as researchers. But I also think that one of those barriers is actually how knowledge is produced. Both academic research and practical expertise are increasingly siloed. We become more and more specialized. And this specialization actually leads to less integration and less holistic analysis of context and situations. And this means that specialized experts end up talking to themselves in these sort of echo chambers, and that they're only held accountable by their peers and not by other specialists. And it leads to what I would call a lack of cross-sectoral accountability. And this is why discussions like the one we have today are so important. Well, this specialization is really amazing in terms of depth and precision. I think it has practical consequences on the ability to take in knowledge from other areas. And while people are able to agree to the principle of fuller, more comprehensive analysis or interventions, this siloing can lead to a sense that someone else is doing it. I'm busy with my stuff, and the gender expert or the disaster risk reduction expert or the conflict expert should be the ones providing the other perspectives, right? But it can also create an overload on implementing partners or program officers who are expected to absorb a great amount of specialized information through a plethora of guidance notes, trainings, coordination meetings. And if considered in humanitarian situations where, as mentioned, the tyranny of the urgent rules, the likelihood of integrating other issues into your work becomes even more reduced. So while accountability measures can help to some extent, we are sometimes placing implementers between a rock and a hard place because capacity and time to do everything is in fact limited. And especially as donor timeframes to produce transformative results are normally completely unrealistic. And I think this is further reflected in sort of specialized agencies, and especially within the UN, where this specialization is also driven by funding interests to keep the bigger portion of the budget to issues aligned to your own specialization, rather than sharing it with other agencies or specialized interventions. So as we agree on the benefits of integrating issues of gender, disaster and conflict, I believe that it's important that we consider the practical implementation of such an agenda as well. And we need to understand that, understand how we can incentivize people and institutions, not only through accountability measures, but by reforming funding structures and finding innovative ways of creating collaborations. Making a more comprehensive and integrated analysis of your work part of the job description should not be regarded as an additional burden, but rather as widening the toolbox. And this panel meeting here today is a great start for such discussions. And thank you, Tobias, for initiating it. I'll end here. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Suzanne. Again, fascinating talk. Perhaps a bit similar to Marissa. I like how you also, and at least that you put forward, at least what I interpret to be a positive note when we talk about agency and women as catalysts for change. And I also like your metaphor of an echo chamber in which some expert or practitioner discourses are trapped without resonating really to the broader outside. I hope we can avoid that a bit. At least a lot of people here have some practice experience as well as some academic experience. So perhaps we can try to bridge the gap a bit this morning, noon, or evening, depending on where you are sitting. Okay, as you might know from the program, we have a fourth speaker, Ombara Isaac, who I don't see in the chat. He sent me his presentations a few minutes ago. So I don't know why, I don't know what happened. I haven't lost that he might join us in a few minutes or so, but I would suggest for now that we move on with the discussion. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, remarks, or comments, or also one of the panelists, please raise your hand or post something in the chat or Q&A function, which I will monitor. It's still empty, so perhaps too many good inputs. If there is no urgent question, I would like to ask a very broad question to all three panelists, perhaps. So my question is, if some very big foundation or UN agency would approach you tomorrow and basically say, hey, look, there's something you want to do about disasters, climate change, gender, peace, and conflict, and money really doesn't matter. What do we need to do? And it could be research, it could be practice, it could be activist research, could be a mix of all three of those. What would be your answer? Like, where's basically what are the biggest challenges ahead of us? What needs to be done in the next 2 or 5 years?
All right, I can offer a few comments, and not necessarily suggesting that this is the only or the most important thing that needs to be done, but something I would like to work on is to empirically demonstrate or investigate rather than demonstrate causal links between the various components that we have been discussing. And in the literature, we are frequently mention the correlation between these factors, and it makes rational sense that there would be an interrelation between them. But although we have an increasingly large body of literature of case studies discussing the conditions side by side, I think that additional work is needed in using a cross-cultural approach to try to verify if indeed there is an attribution, a causal link that can be established between the various dimensions that we have mentioned here. And especially considering that this presentation is being sponsored by the Peace Building, Environmental Peace Building Association, which has a very strong practical component, demonstrating empirically the effectiveness of this approach of using environmental issues as an entry point for facilitating dialogue and collaboration among parties, and through that, increase the effectiveness of peace building. It makes perfect logical sense. We don't have enough empirical evidence that unequivocally demonstrate attribution. And of course, it is a challenging environment in which to work, but I think that more work needs to be done in that respect. That would be something that I would like to do. And then with respect to the gender component, I think that additional work is needed on the issue of masculinities. Even, we know that gender is a relational variable, and that even if we're primarily interested in the position and the situation of women in a particular context, we are not going to properly understand that situation without relating it to the situation of men and potentially other gender categories that might be recognized, because gender is not necessarily binary, but not enough attention is being paid to the issue of masculinities, and studies and projects that purport to be gender inclusive are often very stereotypical, with women associated, women at risk and men as risk, and that is problematic. And I think that that needs to be, you know, the distinction needs to be unpacked, and how both disasters, conflict, and the combination of both affect both women and men in other categories differently. So those are two areas that I am particularly interested in, and I think it would make a contribution to a better understanding of the synergies between all of these factors that we've been discussing.
Perhaps I can add something to this. I fully endorse Marissa's point about emphasizing masculinities. As a metaphor, it's a bit like when we have a problem physiologically with one of our limbs, for example, I don't know, like a knee or an arm. Sometimes the physio tells us that it's actually not on the problematic part of our body that we need to work, it's on the other one that tries to compensate for the pain. I don't know if I'm making sense, but through that metaphor, I just want to say that a lot of gender-related projects, interventions, research focus on women and girls because they are the most vulnerable, they're the most blah, blah. But by doing this, we re-emphasize the divides and the backlash against women and girls. Whereas, especially in the context of the Sahel, if we had unlimited funding to be re-injected into offering sustainable livelihoods opportunities to everybody, men and boys in particular, then they would be less, they would be more busy and less busy focusing on re-emphasizing the norms on women and girls, on what they can or cannot do. So I think, yeah, if there was unlimited funding, it would not go necessarily to research, it would go on trying to provide people with tangible livelihoods prospects, injecting massively in education as well. And then hopefully in a few decades, there could be a whole new generation of people that can help from the context, not people outsiders coming in to say how things should be done, but people within a country taking the matter in their own hands and say, this is the future we want. And everyone is contributing to shaping that future. It's a bit woo, but if we have unlimited funding, let's get crazy a bit.
Let's.
Sorry, I can only agree, and I think in terms of the interventions that are, I mean, we already have a lot of interventions that are perfectly, you know, well aimed at what we need to be doing. It's just that it's not large scale enough. And I would love to see a regular sort of livelihoods project or resilience project or program that is actually large scale. It's very rare to, and gender mainstream, that's what I wanted to say, like to that is truly gender mainstream, because you don't really see any. And if you do see them, they're very small scale. So it's very hard to gauge, you know, what impact does this program actually do. So you don't need to reinvent much, but you do need to, but if you do have these kind of projects, if they were truly gender mainstreamed, you would see other results than what you see if you have these sort of pockets of projects. And I think in terms of what is included in those projects, that's, you know, based on what we know works in terms of, you know, ensuring that there's participation, ensuring that we hear the, you know, the knowledge and voices from different sets of people and not only those in powers, and that we have a good sort of analysis of the power issues within any communities, and that we don't exacerbate existing inequalities. But there's something interesting as well. I fully agree with the whole issue of masculinities. And I would bring that to just sort of understanding norms and behaviors and how they're interlinked with structures, and sort of how we can, if we do provide livelihoods, how does that change or impact on norms, as Virginie was saying, in terms of because there is an interaction between how people are surviving, basically, whether that's through livelihoods or social reproduction, and the structures and the opportunities that sort of exist within a community or in a society. And when looking at norms, it's quite easy to sort of, and I think that's been discussed a lot in terms of the, we don't want to touch upon that because that seems too, sensitive, or we don't want to go in and, disrupt local sort of power balances. But I think we need to realize that whatever we do disrupts. We do have an impact, whatever we do. And we should rather do that with knowledge and with be prepared for it rather than ignoring it. And I also think, just like we say that disasters are not natural, there's no such thing as natural disasters, they're sort of socially constructed. And I think the division of labor, whether you believe or don't believe that this is a natural division of labor, there's nothing natural about depletion of women and girls, or there's nothing natural about exploiting, vulnerable people, which happens in, many situations. So I think when there's been a disruption, it's not that easy, even if you do want to go back to those traditional roles and traditional norms, the underlying fabric might not be there to support how that's implemented. So in terms of, I'm speaking very much from my own subject in terms of social reproduction, looking at how, if we have this gender division of labor, men do their work, sort of more productive side, and women do social reproductive work. That's based on the assumption that there's some sort of social fabric that supports that division of labor. And that social fabric is often disrupted, especially in crisis. So in terms of kinships, in terms of social infrastructure, and how, whether there's opportunities for, receiving money for social reproduction through your sort of spouse, and so forth. So in terms of believing that you can either go back to something, that's more normal, or even believing that we can be neutral when we take part or implement programs, I think that's something we really need to rethink. And I think, going back to your question, I think that's something that would really need to be part of any programming.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot for the again very insightful comments. I would have a ton of follow-up questions for each one of you, but there's one question in the chat by Caitlin Ryan, which I would like to address. And afterwards, I saw that Isaac also joined us now. So my suggestion is we start with Caitlin's question because it directly refers to the presentations. And then, Isaac, you will get the chance to, I think he left us again. Perhaps his internet is unstable. Let's see. So anyway, we start with Caitlin's question. And Caitlin, I will, if that's okay with you, I will allow you to talk now, so you can address the question yourself rather than me reading it. If that works out, let's try.
Hi, Caitlin.
Caitlin says 1 minute. Her mic is off. That's fine. We can perhaps take it to drink some water or digest a few of the insights. Or what I perhaps do is I start reading the question, and if Caitlin, if you get your microphone to work in between, please interrupt me, take over and ask or explain your question yourself, because I'm pretty sure you can do it much better than I can just read it. But in case there's continuous problems with the microphone, we make sure your questions is not lost. So I have a comment related to Marissa's reference to complexity and Virginie's reference to resilience. Virginie, I really appreciated your references to structural violence, but I'm always a little unsettled by mentions of resilience or complexity that seem to place the burden on local women to become resilient to crisis they're not responsible for causing, and without tackling the gendered and racialized global relations of power. In other words, what is the need to consider the role of the global when we think about complexity or resilience? What is the risk that this may just replicate the idea that the problem is limited to local culture and that local women are responsible for resilience building?
All right, well, since I was that it?
Yes, that was the question.
All right. I've actually written about the idea of resilience because I agree the way it is being constructed and applied in certain contexts, I find it problematic. Many understandings of resilience think of it as the independent variable. There's the assumption that there's some kind of threat, there's some kind of risk, there's something out there that is taken for granted and that we are not planning on modifying that. And the expectation is that the local population, those affected by it, be that women, be that indigenous groups, be that whoever it is, are expected to be resilient and adapt to it. And I think that much more focus on the root causes of the problem need to be put in place, instead of simply expecting that people will adapt and that people will be resilient. This is also problematic in the more recent literature on children and youth peace and security. On the surface, the tone seems increasingly positive. The young people are resilient. Young people are expected not to be, but the result is that we shift the blame, if that is the right way to put it, to avoid focusing on what the problem is and expecting the people affected by it to adapt and be resilient and just take it. That's what it sounds like to me. And so if that is the way the question was, what the question meant, I would completely agree with that perspective. I find resilience-based approaches increasingly problematic in that respect.
And perhaps to add a comment, thank you, Caitlin, for your questions. If I understand your point correctly, I fully endorse it. I think the majority of the world's current development issues are at the global scale and not at the local level. The problem also with the interventions of Western governments through this whole international development business or circus, depending how you want to call it, we kind of also impose a lot of norms, a lot of ready-made recipe for what those in power think things ought to be. And that's problematic. And that's also unfortunately driving funding agendas, and those funding agendas are driving research agendas, and that frame the way research questions are being posed, which is one of the point I was trying to make earlier, which is instead of asking why or how climate change increased gender-based violence, let's put that on the side and ask instead, why are we still facing gender-based violence, and how does that undermine people's well-being if we don't want to talk about resilience? So I agree with you also that we really need to stop thinking about or adding burdens on women's, as Susan mentioned, reproductive unpaid labor. Because in many respects, depending on whose perspective on resilience, they could be seen as extremely resilient already to be surviving in some of those contexts, facing the issues that they're facing, talking about any sort of context at the moment. And so the point really is to say that I agree with you, and that as researchers, I feel like we also need to remind ourselves that we constantly need to bring back the global perspective, the global structures of power that creates those issues on the local level. The last point I want to say is that focusing at the local level or the household level enables to render some of the invisible issues more visible. And that often in the gender studies area is really important, because it's only by making them visible that we can bring them on the political agenda and to try and change things. Then the question remains, who should bring them on the political agenda? Who should talk on behalf of who? This is also where researchers have a responsibility to try and promote more collaboration between local, so-called local, and so-called non-local. Yeah, I'll stop here.
I don't have much to say in addition, but just to reinforce that I also agree with that sort of analysis that, you know, there is a lot of criticism in that field in terms of instrumentalizing women, or in terms of, you know, feminization of survival, as some people call it. And I think that's a really valid issue. At the same time, of course, there are specific issues that, you know, women and men face at the local level that, you know, you want to alleviate somehow, or they want to be alleviated. So in terms of that, I guess there's the issue of sort of strategic issues versus practical issues, but also in terms of alleviating this, to understand that we need to put in policies in place at the same time as we, you know, analyze these, or not only analyze, but address the issues at the global scale. People are still facing the consequences of those global issues at the local level, or at the community level, or in their own households. So of course we need to address that. And as I see it, we need to do that by sharing the burden of that, not by saying, oh great, women are so fantastically resilient, so let's, you know, let our entire policies rely on that resilience. But we need to shift that responsibility to both, well, first of all, we need to recognize it, of course, but we also need to shift that burden. And that's where sort of social policies or social protection policies are being promoted as one answer. But there's also, going back to the norm issue, you know, where are the men in this? So in terms of women, we often promote women as, in terms of gender equality, we often promote women to go into men's fields. And we say they're empowered. And that's also often welcomed by women, because, you know, people take the opportunities that are given to them. And if that means the survival of themselves and their families, that's actually alleviation, even if it means more work. The study I mentioned earlier with regards to social reproduction in Myanmar and Sri Lanka actually saw that the depletion was higher with the women who were in the more conflict affected areas, which had less labor, because there weren't any social institutions or support to support their labor. So there was less to do. whilst the women who lived in less conflict-affected areas, they had a lot more to do. They were busy, but they were less depleted. So, of course, this is also welcome to some extent, the opportunities. But at the same time, we shouldn't just look at women taking on men's responsibilities and say that they're empowered. But that's where the changing of norms and behaviors comes in. And, there's some great examples of in practical implementation where looking at resilience, where the work is done to create this sharing of responsibilities at the household and community levels. So somewhat changing the gender norms. Yeah, just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, if I may, as a quick follow-up.
Marissa, I have to, because Isaac is now in the chat, I would really love to give him a chance to give his presentation as well.
Of course.
Then I think we have one more, then we have even one more questions at least, but first, as Isaac made it, and I want to make sure he didn't prepare his presentation for nothing and gets the time. So Isaac, what I will do now is I will promote you as a panelist, so you will be shortly visible with us here. Fantastic, there you are, Isaac. And what I will do now is I can, and that's credit goes to Marissa because she taught me how to do it. Make you a co-host, which means you can now click on the share screen button at the center bottom part of your screen and share whatever PowerPoint presentation you want to share with me, with us. And you need to unmute yourself first.
Hello, good afternoon to you all.
Hello.
Hello. Sorry for being late, but as they say, better late than never. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
We can see it. We can see it. You can even activate the slideshow if you want to, but we can also see it like that.
Okay. Okay, I'll start by revisiting the introduction question that we were supposed to interrogate as panelists on what will be the benefits in thinking gender, disaster, peace, and conflict together rather than looking at either two or one in isolation. And my thoughts are that the three are intertwined because they are closely linked. And I'll adopt a regional perspective, Africa, but basically the developing world. And in these particular regions, more often, these areas experience both disasters and conflicts concurrently. And these phenomena are likely to create or perpetuate vulnerabilities, both to individuals and communities. And in doing so, they entrench poverty and inequalities, given that they are least developed countries. But quick again, developmental or other development and emerging issues such as climate change and pandemics, like the ongoing COVID pandemic, are bound to worsen these vulnerabilities, considering that conflicts and disasters are daily realities in these particular regions. So my presentation will outline my thoughts, gender roles and vulnerabilities, women in disaster and conflict, gender, peace and conflict, a case study of Kenya. Then we'll have a summary of the results of this study and of course a conclusion. So moving forward, on gender roles and vulnerability. Naturally, women and men play different roles in our society. And similarly, this results in them also taking different roles in the aspects of handling or rather managing disasters and conflict. And these roles either increase or decrease their vulnerabilities to disasters and conflicts. For instance, how either sex is able to either access resources or information, for instance, will influence their capacities to effectively prepare, prevent, mitigate, or even respond to disasters and conflicts. But again, all is not lost, because within this phenomenon of conflicts and disaster, there is a window of opportunity to change societal structures. And these societal structures focus on the inequalities, one of them being gender inequality. Existing literature, current literature suggests that traditional roles are re-emphasized and gender inequalities often worsen in post-disaster or conflict situations. And a very good example is, for example, ceasing hostility does not always guarantee peace for women, since in this particular region, and I mentioned earlier the continental perspective, the developing world, the patriarchal dominance resurfaces often whenever in the aftermath of a disaster and conflict. Then women, disaster and conflict, again, during disaster and conflicts, men and women are affected differently. However, disasters and conflicts, women are impacted more in these times. During disaster and conflicts, women are impacted more. And the reason being that they shoulder burdens such as being caregivers in times of a crisis. And under these, they face the risk of exploitation, infringement of their fundamental rights. And what is worth noting at this particular point is that in this scenario, there lacks a protective support system for the vulnerable women. in that context. And therefore, as we talk of disasters and conflict, then how then do we empower women so that they not only survive beyond the disasters and conflict, but they also become part and parcel of managing these disasters and even offering solutions to these conflicts. And two quick points. One, by ensuring that during reconstruction, then the decision-making structures ensure that both men and women are meaningfully involved in an institutionalized manner, so that when I say institutionalized, both legal and policy, at both legal and policy levels, so that we promote meaningful participation of both sexes. Two, it must be noted that women are particularly effective purveyors of information at any given point, even away from conflict and disasters. And thus, information mechanism should be two-way and accessible for equal inclusion of women and men in the same. Now, I'll quickly move to a recent study that was conducted in Kenya last year. I was part of this study, and the study, the lead researcher was Natasha Muller-Huff, senior lecturer in sociology at Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, Scotland, in the UK. And he conducted a study in Kenya in 2019 to understand the opportunities and challenges in community peace building from the perspective of those involved, especially in poor and marginalized environments with little or no external funding for peace building. And the question that this particular study was answering is how do women in conflict actually engage in peace building? And it's worth noting that there is considerable literature on the links between gender and peace, but the live experiences on the ground of women peace builders are not well captured or rather documented. And that's the question that this study strives to answer. How do women in conflict actually engage in peace building? The gap that necessitated the study was there is considerable literature. I think that one I've mentioned. So the study aimed at providing in-depth insights to women's agency, perception, and contributions to peace building. And at this point, I have to give you the context, some kind of situation analysis in this particular area, which is Kenya, where the study was undertaken. It must be noted that these are simple facts, that Kenya faces multiple hazards that encompass disasters and conflict. And that among the key disasters and conflicts that Kenya faces, one of them is droughts. And the drought has remained the dominant hazard affecting expansive parts of this particular country, with the threat of drought-related emergency being recurrent. The other the disaster is floods, and of course other natural disasters have been a frequent occurrence in some parts of the country. Then on conflict, what stands out are pastoral and political violence. Pastoral, basically in border regions to the west, to the north, these are pastoralist communities, and given these are dry areas. So given the adverse conditions in these dry areas, there is a struggle for scarce and ever diminishing natural resources that include pasture, water. And we've witnessed a cascade of conflicts, and most of them are retaliatory, including cattle rustling that instigate raids. Then the other form of conflict in this region that is common is political violence. And this has been witnessed over a period of since 1992. Kenya holds its general elections every 5 years. In 1992, we had post-election violence. 1997, between 1992 and 2017, the only time that we didn't have any post-election violence was in 2002, where we had a very smooth transition. And moving forward, I've just mentioned that conflict and human-made crises have been witnessed in the region. And of interest is that in 2007, and this is the background of this particular study, that in 2007, 2008, this is the time that we had the worst post-election violence in the country, where we lost more than 1,000 people, 660,000 people were displaced or forcibly moved from their settlements, and we had 40,000. These are recorded cases. The cases might be more. 40,000 victims of gender-based violence. Then, 10 years later, that is now in 2017, the country went to the polls. It was a closely contested election, but of interest is that it was relatively peaceful. We didn't have the upheaval and the kind of lawlessness and violence that we witnessed before. And these are the findings of this particular study.
Isak, as you are already 2 minutes over your time, may I ask you to summarize the results and conclude the presentation?
Yes, I'll summarize this study involved, we interviewed a group of 57 women who were survivors of violence in 2007, 2008. And now they turned around, having been survivors, to propagate peace just before the 2017 general election. And the results were tremendous. They used several ways. One, they organized informal initiatives to monitor and ensure early warning ahead in case to stop any possibility of the recurrence of 2007, 2008. And this was done through dialogue. They also used, given inter-ethnic marriages, it's very common around here. So women who come from other communities and who are married in particular communities acted as mediators to ensure that these communities lived in harmony through dialogue. And finally, there was economic empowerment of people so that they ensure sustainability of their livelihoods through savings and investment. The other thing, and I think it should be the last key finding, is that the study confirmed that unlike the gender stereotypes that have always been there, that women are peacemakers, given their natural roles as mothers and caregivers, this particular study demystifies this stereotype and in fact asserts that women can indeed be effective agents in pursuit of tangible peace. Then also worth noting as a finding was that despite the patriarchal dominance that I had mentioned earlier, that these women rose beyond social structures and they stood out to be counted as peace ambassadors within their community. Then in conclusion, given time, is that now looking at the general perspective around gender disaster and conflicts, and from the findings of this particular study that was conducted in Kenya last year, then the conclusions are basically points to a possible way forward on moving forward, then what steps next. And we're recommending that disaster and post-conflict programming supports should be able, disaster and post-conflict programming should support populations to be able to cope well, recover, fully rebuild and protect themselves against any other future threats, both disaster and conflicts, and that different roles and capacities of men and women in the quest for peace and conflict, and even managing disasters and conflicts, should be able to be recognized, considered, and built upon in the wider context towards the realization of human development strategies. Then gender, disaster, and post-conflict programming was central. And I mentioned data trade. And in these connections, then it's important because it supports relief and development, in relief and development strategies. Then finally, all said and done, the linkage between gender, disaster, and conflict, if well managed, then it will promote reduction in vulnerability for whole populations, both men and women, reduce future risks, and promote gender equality, human development, and sustainable peace on a broader platform. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Feel free to stop your screen sharing. Okay. Yes. Thanks a lot for this insightful presentation, giving us, I think, a very nuanced and good overview about the situation in Kenya and the different and gendered impact that both disasters and conflicts can have there, and the sometimes counterintuitive role of vulnerability and gender in armed conflicts or in political violence. I recognize that we still have a few questions from the audience. However, we are already 8 minutes over time, and I also know that some of us have follow-up commitments, or that it's pretty late, depending on in which time zone you are, and I would like to protect those commitments as well. So despite being motivated to discuss with you perhaps for more than an hour, I would close the webinar for now. In case you have any open questions, I think that, I can't promise, but I would be optimistic at least that the panelists would be happy to receive an email for you and direct you to further research or answer your questions. And there might also be other opportunities to discuss this issue further. So I would like to thank the audience for the questions, also for those who we could not discuss now, and especially the 4 panelists for their insightful presentations and comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.